The crackling static of the radio filled the room, its hissing and popping an oppressive weight pressing down on Frank's mind. He lay on the cold concrete floor, every inch of his body aching as if he'd been run over by a truck. The dim light above flickered intermittently, casting jagged shadows that seemed to twist and flicker with the rhythm of his heartbeat. He stared up at the ceiling, feeling like his thoughts were drifting away on the same static that filled the room. He hadn't slept in what felt like days, maybe longer. His mind was a jumbled mess of memories and half-formed thoughts. A burst of sharp, crackling clicks sliced through the fog of his mind. Frank's eyes snapped open, heart racing in a cold panic. The radio's hissing grew louder, then clearer. "Frank, do you read me? Over." The voice continued. "Frank, this is Price. Do you read me? Over." Frank's body jerked to life. His heart thudded painfully in his chest as his hands reached out toward the radio, but his fingers were stiff, uncoordinated. He couldn't grasp it. It felt like a dream, a cruel, twisted dream, but the voice was so real, so alive. Could it be him? Could Price have made it out of captivity? Price! Frank croaked, the words coming out cracked, weak. His voice barely held up as his mind struggled to make sense of what was happening. "You're alive! You escaped." The radio crackled again, but this time, the voice sounded more strained, distant, almost mechanical. "Never mind that, Frank. We need to get you out of there." Pass the radio to Rodriguez. Frank jumped back in horror as the body beside him in the chair reached out to him. The radio slipped from Frank's hand and fell to the ground with a hollow clatter. The soldier's dead, bloodied fingers grabbed the radio. His mouth, twisted in a grotesque mockery of life, gaped open in an unnatural way. The soldier held the radio to his lips, but there was no sound, only the sickening slur of blood gurgling, the silent pleading from a mouth that should have been closed forever. Frank's vision blurred. His breath came in shallow, quick bursts. The room began to tilt, as if the walls themselves were warping, pressing down on him. This isn't real. Can't be real. He shut his eyes, but when he opened them again, Rodriguez was still there. The soldier's eyes were wide, staring directly at him. Lifeless, hollow. His head split open from the shot that freed him from his captivity. A twisted, ragged smile formed on the dead man's face, though it wasn't human. It was wrong, something far darker than death itself. Frank recoiled, his mind screaming, but his body felt like it was frozen in place. His stomach churned violently. He wanted to look away, but he couldn't. The radio crackled again, and Frank heard Price's voice, distant, distorted now, coming through the static. The dead soldier twitched, the blood dripping in slow, measured intervals from his mouth, making a wet splatter on the floor. The blood, it couldn't be real. He was dead. Frank had found Rodriguez executed in a bunker on the front line what seemed like a lifetime ago. The room was spinning faster now, the shadows closing in on him. Frank's body jerked violently, his legs kicking out in a desperate attempt to flee. His hands gripped at the floor as if trying to steady himself against the ground that felt like it was shifting beneath him. The walls of the room seemed to close in, pressing down on him, suffocating him. He couldn't tell if the ceiling was lowering or if he was rising toward it. The world was warping, bending, folding in on itself. The stench of death was thick in the room, suffocating Frank. It was too much. His mind could no longer decipher what was real from what was imagined. The hallucinations were swallowing him whole. Frank's vision darkened as the weight of the past crashed in on him. Price, Rodriguez, the war, the deaths, the screams, the endless suffering. His soul felt pulled into the blackness, dragged by the overwhelming weight of everything he'd seen and done. As the sound of gunfire echoed down the hallways of the abandoned factory, Frank's temporary sanctuary, his mind snapped back into reality, as if he had fallen from the sky and landed on the floor of that small basement room, shocking him back into a state of full consciousness. Gunfire echoed relentlessly through the factory, each shot reverberating down the hallways and seeping into the room. Above, a savage battle raged in the factory's upper levels, but here, in this corner of hell, there was only the silence of death. The body tied to the chair in front of Frank hung limply, its blood slowly dripping onto the cold, concrete floor. A black bag still covered its head, an undignified shroud for someone already lost. The radio that had once crackled with frantic transmissions now lay dead, just like everything else. A flickering light from a small fire burning in the hallway provided the only illumination, casting erratic shadows that spread across the walls like demons crawling out of the depths of hell. Frank's mind was a whirl of confusion. Was this all real? Or was he already a ghost, trapped in some nightmare he could never escape? The sounds of combat, distant but unmistakable, began to fade as Frank stripped the empty magazine from his weapon and let it fall to the floor with a hollow clink. The next shot had to count. He slammed the last remaining magazine into the rifle, feeling the weight of it in his hands, the final piece of the puzzle. There was no turning back now. He had to get to the western outskirts. He had to find Charlie. Rising from his crouch, Frank's body protested, muscles aching and adrenaline spiking. There was no time to waste. He couldn't stay hidden forever. The factory, once a place of industry, was now a grotesque monument to violence. The walls were caved in, the ceilings crumbling, and bodies lay scattered across the floors, each one a reminder of the chaos that had consumed this place. Blood stained the concrete, pooling in dark, wet patches. It was a slaughterhouse, pure and simple, the aftermath of a war too savage to be forgotten. He moved cautiously down the hallway, stepping over bodies as if they were just another obstacle in his path. A fire further down the hall flickered weakly, its light casting violent shadows on the walls, twisting, writhing shapes that made the dead seem like they were still moving. The bloodstains on the walls weren't just marks of death. They bled across the surface like something alive, as though the very walls mourned the violence that had been done here. Frank's skin crawled. The nightmare had become too real. As he reached the stairwell to the main floor, Frank felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. Thick smoke swirled down toward him, heavy with the stink of burning flesh and chemicals. His chest tightened, instinctively recognizing the sickly, metallic scent of phosphorus mixed with the stench of charred meat. He had smelled it before. It was a smell that would haunt him forever. With deliberate care, Frank began to ascend the stairs, his rifle raised, eyes scanning every corner. When he reached the top, the cause of the foul odor became tragically clear. A body, or what was left of one, lay in the hallway. The remains had been reduced to a charred, blackened husk by an incendiary device, flesh and bone indistinguishable, consumed by fire. Frank stepped over the corpse, his mind focused, unwilling to linger on the horror. He had no time for pity. The factory was littered with the remains of this savage conflict. Empty shell casings scattered across the floors like a trail leading to nowhere. Frank moved forward, his rifle sweeping the room as he approached the exit. The ruins of the factory were mirrored in the ruins outside. He ducked behind an overturned desk, peering cautiously out the window. The street outside was a war zone, the houses across the way little more than crumbling skeletons. The neighborhood was gone, destroyed so thoroughly that the ruins seemed like the remnants of some ancient civilization, long buried beneath the weight of its own destruction. He couldn't wait. Frank had no choice but to run, to make a break for it and pray there was no one lying in wait outside. He bolted from the factory, sprinting across the street and into the nearest ruined house. The home was a wreck, its walls shredded by shelling, the front yard a graveyard for civilians caught in the crossfire. Frank didn't stop. He kept moving, ducking through the backyard and into the next house. It was more of the same, devastation and death. The front yard was littered with the bodies of civilians, innocent people crushed beneath the unforgiving weight of war. There was no escape from it, not for anyone. The neighborhood had been erased, its occupants reduced to nothing more than casualties of a brutal, unrelenting conflict. Gunfire echoed through the ruined neighborhood, coming from every direction. a constant reminder of the violence that had consumed the place. Frank moved with caution, house by house, navigating the shattered landscape. Many buildings had been reduced to nothing but rubble, their skeletal remains standing like the broken bones of some forgotten giant. Here and there, an overturned swing set or a smashed picket fence was all that remained of a home once filled with laughter and life. The memory of what had been lost weighed heavily on Frank's chest. Images of drones flashed in his mind, unblinking eyes circling high above, their engines roaring like predators. Then, like birds of prey, they would dive, releasing their deadly payloads with a deafening screech. Buildings, lives, entire families obliterated in an instant. The war had crushed everything beneath its iron heel, leaving only echoes and silence in its wake. Frank felt the suffocating weight of it all, the war grinding into his very soul. He stayed low, instinctively keeping out of sight as he climbed into one of the ruined houses. The structure had been all but destroyed, its walls collapsed inwards, leaving a maze of debris. Among the wreckage, Frank spotted a large cabinet that had toppled over, wedged half into the remnants of a wall. A small cavern had formed beneath it, a perfect hiding spot. Without hesitation, Frank crawled into the cramped space, burrowing himself deep into the rubble, where he could blend in with the destruction around him. Here, in this small, forgotten corner of the world, he would be another ghost, another corpse among many. It was a bitter comfort, the only thing that allowed him to rest for a brief moment, shielded from the bullets that tore through the air outside. The distant rattle of gunfire continued, relentless and unyielding, as Frank lay beneath the half-fallen cabinet. The shadows grew longer, and the day's light began to dim, casting the neighborhood into the quiet embrace of dusk. The world outside felt as if it was unraveling, the battle raging on as if it would never end. Frank remained half alert, his weapon aimed at the open landscape, every muscle in his body tense, ready for anything. He knew that sleep could be a dangerous thing in this hellscape, but his body demanded it. He allowed himself a moment to rest, to gather strength for the next leg of his journey. But then, the rumble of an explosion shook the ground, pulling Frank back into full awareness. His body jolted in shock. He had fallen asleep, though he had no idea for how long. The battle outside was far from over. The darkness had deepened, and the moonlight illuminated the ruins, casting everything in an eerie glow. The air was thick with the acrid stench of burning buildings and the sharp, metallic tang of phosphorus. Tracers flew overhead, streaking across the sky like lightning bolts. Each burst of phosphorus exploding above the neighboring blocks painted the sky with sparkles, turning the night into a terrible, beautiful spectacle. The bright flashes lit the horizon, staining the air with a sickly orange hue, as if the very heavens were ablaze. But Frank didn't have the luxury of time to appreciate the spectacle. The destruction around him was a ticking clock, and he needed to keep moving. He couldn't afford to stay where he was any longer. He knew that he had to find a safer place if he hoped to get any more rest. With a grunt, Frank pulled himself out from under the collapsed cabinet. His limbs ached with exhaustion, but he pushed through it, his survival instincts kicking in. He crawled out of the house, moving swiftly into the backyard. There, he found an old cellar door, partially shattered but still offering the promise of some shelter. It was his best option, considering the inferno raging outside. Without a second thought, he dropped down into the dark cellar, landing hard on the cold, uneven floor. His rifle was gripped tightly in his hands, his eyes immediately scanning the dark, the tension rising in his chest. And then, in the far corner of the room, he saw them. 3 figures huddled together, their faces wide with terror. A man, a woman, and a child. The man stood protectively in front of them, a shotgun held loosely in his hands, the barrel angled downward. The woman clutched her child close, their faces masks of fear, as though they believed Frank was the Grim Reaper come to claim them. For a long, unbearable moment, Frank stared at the man. His eyes were dark and tired, but there was something else there, something familiar. Frank saw himself in the man. A soldier, fighting to survive. A man trying to protect what little he had left. It was as if they were two sides of the same coin. The air between them was thick with the unspoken knowledge that survival in this war was a brutal, unforgiving thing. The man didn't move, didn't speak, just stood frozen in the darkness, watching Frank as though waiting for him to make the first move. Frank could feel the weight of the moment, the tension hanging between them. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Frank gave a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of the man's determination, a silent agreement that they both understood the fragile thread on which their lives hung. With equal silence, Frank backed out of the cellar, careful not to make any sound. He knew that his presence would only bring more danger to this family, that they stood a better chance if he simply moved on. The man's gaze followed him as Frank slipped back into the yard and continued on, knowing that leaving them behind was the only choice. Frank moved swiftly, crossing into the next yard, his every step guided by the dim light from the burning neighborhood and the random explosions lighting up the sky above. The tracers zipped across the heavens like thin ribbons of light, painting the night with streaks of danger. The world was on fire, and Frank was just another shadow slipping through the ruins, desperately holding on to the hope that somehow, someway, he would make it out of this alive.